Okay, so we are looking at bioenergetics, which is basically bio, life, and energy. So the interaction between how living things utilize energy and how that moves throughout the organisms as well as throughout the ecosystems in which they live. In this unit, we'll be looking at understanding redox reaction, which is just a fancy way of saying the two types of reactions here, oxidizing and reducing reactions. We'll also look at how photosynthesis and cell respiration are interdependent on each other and then go into each of them individually. Okay, so a review of Earth's history. This is really what we've been looking at for the unit, or for the year. So we started out by looking at what came before life, we looked at the prokaryotic cells, and now we're getting into the eukaryotic cells, just to kind of put everything into context. And here, this should clue you off. The atmospheric oxygen, the fact that it happened during the time of the prokaryotes, should kind of get you questioning here in a sec. I'll explain why. Okay, we can start by looking at the reaction of photosynthesis. Big picture here is that the chloroplast is the location. Light is going to be used to be converted into ATP. That extra ATP is used to make sugars. Okay, here's the reaction down here, carbon dioxide and water being converted into glucose and oxygen. That does require solar energy, obviously, but if you're taking a look at this, you're thinking, okay, chloroplast, that has to do with the with eukaryotes. So how is it possible that an atmospheric oxygen could have evolved or could have occurred if there were no eukaryotes yet, right? How are we going to get this process of photosynthesis going to be able to make the oxygen in the first place? And the answer is that cyanobacteria can also photosynthesize. They do it a little bit differently, but at the end of the day, they're still able to fix carbon dioxide and make their own food. What this means is that they are an autotroph. And when we talk about things being fixed, we just mean being able to convert it from an inorganic to an organic source. When we say food, here we're talking about any kind of source of usable chemical energy. So again, plants, algae, cyanobacteria are all autotrophic, ergo they can all photosynthesize. Okay, switching gears, we can look at cellular respiration, which is the exact opposite. Here we're taking glucose and oxygen and using it to break down into carbon dioxide and water. So photosynthesis, we started with CO2 and H2O. We needed the input of energy, and here are our products. In cellular respiration, glucose and oxygen are the reactants, CO2 and water are the products. And so what's happening is we're starting with glucose, we're breaking it down step by step by step, and every time you break the bond, a little bit of energy is released. That energy is carried over here to another step we'll talk down the road on, but at the end of the day, all that temporary storage of energy gets stored out, or gets made into ATP, allowing animals and plants that don't have light at the time to be able to do things because they have ATP. And just like before, big picture is that prokaryotes could do this. They're kind of like early cellular respiration that was happening with them. Okay, so if we're thinking about the fact that prokaryotes could do cell respiration and photosynthesis, then we need to look at a process called endosymbiosis. We already talked about this a little bit here, but essentially we've got a mitochondria that was actually prokaryotic, so before it became integrated into the eukaryotic cell. This would have been engulfed into a larger cell, and within the cell, rather than getting broken down, would have been able to provide functioning for the larger cell. So at this point, this is going to be the basis of all animals and fungi. But then if we take a look here, some of that lineage would have also been able to incorporate what became the chloroplast, and that would have been plants. There we go. So we have really 4 pieces of evidence that you should be familiar with here in the ideas of endosymbiosis. We have a 70S ribosome, circular DNA, and replication via binary fission. So all 3 of those things here, 1, 2, and 3, are all things that are reminiscent of the prokaryotes, right? These are not characteristics that you're going to see in eukaryotes. They're very prokaryotic characteristics, and the fact that the chloroplast and mitochondria have those features indicate that that would be early prokaryotic. Now, the fact that there's a double membrane, let's take a look at why that would be. So in endocytosis, right? We've got the cell membrane here wrapping up whatever is being engulfed. So what we have is a kind of vesicle around the eukaryotic cell. Then the actual membrane of the prokaryote is here. So the double membrane is indicating that it had been engulfed by the larger cell. Same thing is true for the chloroplast. Okay. Redox reactions are a little bit on the tricky side, so I'm not expecting you to completely understand it quite yet, but the big picture here is that electrons are transferred from one substance to another, right? Right? So a pair of electrons get transferring. The substance that receives the electrons is called reduced because the overall charge of that atom or molecule has become more negative because of the electrons, and the other substance is called oxidized because oxygen tends to be what is pulling the electrons away. So you don't need to know that little fact, that's okay. So in terms of energy, if we're thinking about electrons carrying energy, right, chemical bonds and covalent bonds having a sharing of electrons. So anytime electrons move from one place to another, they essentially carry energy. Molecules with more electrons are typically higher energy, and molecules with fewer electrons are typically at a lower energy state. So that leads us back to photosynthesis, cell respiration, right? Photosynthesis is going to take carbon dioxide and build it up into glucose. So that is a reducing reaction. We've reduced CO2 into glucose, which is also a positive delta G. On the flip side, cellular respiration is going to oxidize glucose or break it down into CO2. So a negative delta G, which is then going to be coupled with the positive delta G of ADP into ATP. Okay? So we'll go over this a little bit more. All right. And finally, we need to talk about matter and energy. So what is the relationship between cellular respiration and photosynthesis? Is that they are literally exact opposites. You can take the reactions here and the reaction, either reaction, basically flip it backwards and you get the other. So CO2 and water get converted into organic molecules and O2. Throughout all of that, the carbon, the hydrogen, and the oxygen stays consistent if you balance it, because matter is constantly cycled through an ecosystem. On the flip side, with energy, we constantly need a new input of energy that gets converted around, and energy is lost because of the second law of thermodynamics, which basically says we've got a constant increase of entropy. So every time energy transfers from one form to another, just a little bit of it is lost, right? It's not completely efficient. And so for this reason, whereas matter is recycled, we say energy flows through ecosystems. And so we can take a look at a diagram like this. We can see that this is the sun. In this diagram, everything red represents energy. And so the type of energy coming from the sun is electromagnetic. And that's going to be hitting the autotrophs, remember, plant, algae, and cyanobacteria. That is then incorporated into chemical bonds to become chemical energy. But some of that energy during that conversion is lost as heat. In blue, that is matter. And so where do autotrophs get their matter from? That is going to be inorganic sources, and because they are capable of fixing carbon, in other words, converting from inorganic to organic, we know that over here, bam, organic. Okay. Anyway, that's the end. We'll go over cell respiration more on Monday, and have a delightful weekend.